again, everyone. It's David Thompson with Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm joined today by Dr. Michael David Cohen, who is an assistant research professor of history, as well as the assistant editor of the James K. Polk papers at the University of Tennessee. But today we're going to be talking about Dr. Cohen's latest book, which is Reconstructing the Campus, Higher Education and the American Civil War, which is now out with the University of Virginia Press. So, Dr. Cohen, thanks so much for taking some time and talking with us today.
Thank you for having me, David.
If you could just offer us perhaps a brief overview of the book as a whole, just to start us off.
Of course. The book looks at the impact of the Civil War on American higher education. So in the first chapter, I focused on the 4 years of the Civil War itself, the experiences that students had during the war, as well as professors and trustees, and especially the experiences that the colleges themselves went through, the challenges that they faced in order to continue educating students and simply to stay open or stay intact during 4 years of war. Things like in the South, they had a number of campuses actually played host to battles. William and Mary famously was part of the Battle of Williamsburg. And even colleges that weren't nearby battles often were taken over by armies, whether northern or southern, and across the country, colleges lost students as they enlisted in the northern and southern armies. It was a very difficult time for colleges to carry on their work. Then the rest of the book looks at a much larger period, from about 1860 until the late 1870s and early 80s, to see how the Civil War left a lasting impact on colleges in terms of who attended college, what they studied there, and to a large extent, the relationship changed between colleges and the state and federal governments. That's a large portion of it as well.
Now, it's an awfully large topic when you think of just higher education during the Civil War. How did you decide to approach it, I guess from a sample standpoint, at the same time recognizing the fact that you wanted to try to be as representative as possible of the country as a whole to really, I guess, support your thesis?
Yes, you're right. It is a huge topic. We don't know the exact number of colleges in the 19th century because records are limited and so many colleges kept opening and closing. But by the time of the Civil War, there were somewhere around 400 colleges. And it's impossible to study them all in depth, partly because there's so much data available, and partly because colleges in many cases closed between then and now, so the archives don't exist. What I did was choose a small number of colleges. I looked at 7 schools primarily, but select schools that were representative in a number of ways of higher education around the country. I picked schools from all regions, the Northeast, Southeast, the Midwest, and the Far West, and the different types of colleges that were around in the 1860s. Men's colleges, women's colleges, coeducational colleges, state universities, and denominational, or what we might call private colleges, to get a broad picture of higher education and to be able to compare the impact of the war on different regions and different types of institutions. In addition, I was able to use some federal and state government sources and various national sources such as almanacs, and there was a national student newspaper actually in the 1860s that were able to give me a larger picture of higher education at the time.
Now, based on your research, what impact did the Civil War actually have on these campuses long term, I guess? You mentioned that there's going to be a changing relationship following the war. What really was that relationship like?
Well, after the Civil War, really starting during it, the federal government expanded into many areas of American life where it hadn't been involved before. It was during the Civil War that we got the first national income tax, and certainly during the war, the federal government had to expand in order simply to win the war, to create a large army and to administer that army. As they were doing that, the federal government also started to get involved in many other things. Famously, during the Civil War, Congress passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, which for the first time provided indirect federal funding to colleges. And as a result, the federal government was able to encourage the expansion of agricultural education and engineering education in colleges, as well as military training. This was a bill that had passed before the Civil War, but James Buchanan as president had vetoed it. During the war, by using the military need, Justin Morrill, who was its big proponent in Congress, was able to convince Congress that they needed to pay attention to higher education and use it in order to serve government needs, such as the training of young men to fight in a war. Also, more generally, the federal government started expanding administratively into many areas. It was during the war that they created the Agriculture Department, and shortly after the war, as part of that expansion, they created what again became the Department of Education. It was a way for the government to keep track of what was going on in education, both higher and lower across the country. They collected statistics and reported this information to the states and to Congress so that states and local governments would be able to use it to improve education at the local level.
I have to ask, what drew you to this topic? It seems like a rather unique topic to explore, but what drew you in?
I came to this mainly out of an interest in the 19th century generally and the history of education. I'd always been fascinated by the fact that right from the beginning, the early 17th century, Americans had given a lot of attention to institutions to educate their children, to prepare their children. One of the first things that the colonists did in each of the British colonies in America was establish a school, and in the case of the Puritans, just a few years after they arrived in Massachusetts Bay, they built a college, Harvard. Then as people started traveling west, especially in the 19th century, colleges were one of the main things that they focused on. If you established a new town in some Midwestern area, the first thing you did was build a church, and the second thing was usually build a college. So many little towns have colleges. And it always seemed remarkable to me that they gave so much attention to this activity. So I started to look at the development of higher education and found that historians largely agreed that around the 1860s there was this big shift in higher education. We start to get the first real universities and a great diversification of both who attends college and what they study. So African Americans and women more often are able to attend college, and it's possible not just to study the liberal arts curriculum, but now you can learn engineering, agriculture, law, medicine in college. So we have this real expansion going on in the 1860s and thereafter, but people hadn't really connected it to the Civil War, that other event of the 1860s. So I started to look into how these two were connected, how the Civil War might have helped to drive this shift in colleges. And as I found, it really was a major motivating factor, not just in that developing relationship with the federal government, but in the expansion of higher education generally.
Now, by looking into this idea, right, looking at colleges and universities during the Civil War and this transitionary period, what happens in the aftermath, what do you think is the ultimate takeaway? What can we learn as, say, someone who is either a scholar of the Civil War or just someone who's very much vested in the war itself? How does looking at this particular area kind of broaden and deeper our understanding of the war as a whole?
The main takeaway, I think, is that the war had a very broad impact on American life and culture. Traditionally, I think in Civil War scholarship, we look at three main areas. We look at political history, military history, and history of emancipation, all of which are very important topics, and there are very good reasons why we focused on those. But in recent years, people have started to look at the war's impact in a much broader way. People have studied how the Civil War impacted reading habits, how it impacted our understanding of time. Drew Faust famously wrote about the Civil War's impact on our understanding of death. What I'm doing is expanding that trend. I'm looking at how the Civil War impacted this area of life that is really central to American culture, but doesn't have an obvious connection with the military conflict. It shows that this war really dominated people's lives. They couldn't avoid thinking about it. So many had a direct connection with the war, and helped to change areas of life beyond what was going on in the battlefield.
Now, there's so much scholarship out there, but has there been a book as of late related to the Civil War that's really caught your eye that you might recommend to our readers?
There's actually one that just came out this year. Walter Johnson's River of Dark Dreams. Walter, I think, is really one of our most innovative Civil War scholars. I was lucky enough to be at Harvard when he was working on this book, so I was able to hear a lot about the development of his analysis. I really think as he starts to look beyond the idea of sectionalism that has driven so much antebellum scholarship, and sort of expand on that to a more broader and multifaceted view of the 19th century. I do think his book is going to help to drive Civil War scholarship for quite a while.
And why do you think, and this is a question I ask many of our guests, so because I find it interesting to kind of get various perspectives on this, Civil War still really attracts so much interest, so much readership out there. Why do you think 150 years on, we still have such an intense interest as a country, really, in this event?
Well, I think that the Civil War, there are a couple of reasons. One is it's simply a compelling story, or a large collection of compelling stories. People's lives were transformed, and people kept excellent written records of this war, including letters between soldiers and their families at home. So it's just a great story to study, far better than any fiction, I think. But the other reason is it helped to create the nation that we live in. The United States had been established in the late 18th century, but it was really the Civil War that not only helped to resolve some questions, would this be a country with slavery, for example, but also helped to create the debates over race, over government, state and federal, and over many areas of American culture that are still around today. And that's what I've tried to show, I think, in my book, and what many scholars, I think, have shown in different areas, that the Civil War sort of began the modern history of higher education and of much of American life and culture.
Now, I'm sure as a scholar you must get this question a lot. You've just finished up a book, so the logical next question is, what's the next project that you're going to explore?
Well, the main project that I'm working on right now, as you mentioned earlier, is the James K. Polk correspondence. This is a very long-term project that's been going on since the 1950s. We're publishing the letters both to and from the 11th president from the 1840s. And actually just next month we're expecting to release volume 12 of President Polk's letters, covering most of the year 1847 during the Mexican War, another war that is given somewhat less attention than the Civil War. So I'm very much focusing on the Polk project. Tom Chafin and I work together on that. And I'm still deciding what my next book besides that will be. Something in 19th century education, but I'm still narrowing down the precise topic.
Well, I think that's fair enough. Well, this is a wonderful start in terms of a foray into the educational experience of the 19th century. So, again, the work is Reconstructing the Campus, Higher Education, and the American Civil War. It's out with the University of Virginia Press. Dr. Cohen, thank you so much for taking some time with us today. I do recommend just to everyone that it really is a phenomenal read. If you're interested in the Civil War, I think you need to pick up this book, because it's worth looking at how did people learn, not only during the war itself, but in the lead up to it, and how did perhaps some of those thoughts impact their decisions during the war and the decisions of the federal government and its changing relationship in the second half of the 19th century. So just wanted to put in a little plug for you there, Dr. Cohen. But thank you so much, and perhaps we can have you on again in the future.
I'd be happy to.